would like to welcome all of you for the webinar today, which is titled Myths and Realities of 5G in India. The session, as I had mentioned, is being recorded, and we are also live streaming it on YouTube. With this, I would like to now begin my welcome speech. So coming to the subject, globally, telecom players, policymakers, think tanks are actively discussing the 5G opportunity, including in India. However, much of the discussion in the public domain has been driven by a business perspective and not so much of a consumer perspective, which is the end user. Anecdotal evidence suggests that there is lack of awareness and misconceptions among consumers about what 5G is expected to deliver and by when. This sparks possibilities of misconceptions and myths in the minds of the consumers. So given this context, we at CUTS had conducted a survey of 500 consumers of 4G services in Delhi in late 2019. The survey attempted to answer the following questions, pretty much set in the Indian context. First, consumer awareness and eagerness about new use cases to be unlocked by 5G and expected time of their availability. It's interesting to note over 60% of the respondents from the survey felt that 5G is a mere hype or just a faster 4G. However, when asked about the level of eagerness to avail augmented and virtual reality services, cloud gaming and smart meters, most consumers responded positively. Furthermore, although the respondents of the survey seemed quite aware about the currently available IoT-driven products and services, such as smart home appliances, smart wearable products, they did highlight high price and limited utility as a barrier for their uptake. Nearly 60% of the respondents were expecting 5G to be commercially available to them by end of this year, and 20% expected it to be available post 2022 in India. Furthermore, respondents were also found to be eagerly waiting to shift to 5G networks to the extent they express willingness to not only change their mobile handset, but also to switch mobile network operators if so required. And last finding, furthermore, consumers also voted for 5G as a key feature in the next mobile handset they purchase. It's interesting to note this was voted higher than many other features such as long battery life, lower prices of devices, better camera quality, which shows the eagerness to avail 5G services. So this is some of the findings from the survey what we had undertaken. And with this context, I would like to welcome all the participants who have joined in this webinar and also our esteemed panelists for the webinar. The focus of today's webinar is largely on three specific myths prevailing in the minds of the consumers, as has been revealed in our survey. That is, 5G is all about enhanced speed. It is mainly a faster 4G. 5G will commercially be available for Indian consumers by end of this year or by 2022. And last but not the least, once available, 5G will replace 4G altogether and fast. With this, I introduce our panelists for the evening, Dr. Arvind Mayaram, the chair for the panel discussion, followed by Professor Paulraj, Ms. Kirti Gupta, Vikram Tiwathia, Mr. T.V. Ramachandran, and Mr. Deepak Maheshwari. So that's the esteemed panel for this session today. And with this, I may now request Dr. Mayaram to kindly invite Dr. Paulraj for his presentation and to take forward the panel discussion. Look forward to an extremely engaging and a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's so much. May I request Dr. Raj to make the presentation, please?
Thank you. Good evening to everybody in India. Thanks for taking me to the webinar. I'm speaking from my home at Stanford University. A 5G webinar, I think, is a good excuse to take our minds away from the health crisis we have today, both in the United States and in India. I'm sure we will get over it, but nevertheless, focus is always welcome. Share my screen. Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, my screen is on.
Yes.
Dr. Paulraj, we've already your screen and we will just help you with that. Sure.
Okay. So my remarks today are broadly about the global picture. I lost touch with the issues in India. I was there in December 2019, the Minister's office regarding the big question on Huawei. But after that, I've not been back in India. So I'm sure Ramachandran and others will have a much closer picture of what's happening in India. So I'm going to talk about the global picture. Next slide. Could I have the next slide?
Just doing that, Professor Paulraj, there's some disturbance at our end. Just give us a second. Sorry for this.
Okay, thank you. So 5G is more than another G. So we know that 2G, GSM was basically voice. 3G was, again, mainly voice, a little bit of data, email, and it uses the technology internet. This is really a big issue. It's really been very impactful on India. But 5G is actually much more than 2, 3, and 4G. It is much more than another G. So, so it's not only, it's going to be, first, certainly a data service with much higher speeds, maybe 10 to 100 times faster, but much more, all kind of new services which will go much beyond human to human communications, machine to machine, human to machine, and so on and so forth. So it's actually much more transformative. So, and I think a huge impact, opportunity for India in areas that we may not today easily guess, but I think that will come. Next slide. Okay, this is an attempt to look at all the applications that 5G can bring. So it's generally considered world over as a very transformational idea of fabric. So on the columns is kind of charting, we are dividing it up human to human, which we're familiar today, human to machine. This also happens a little bit today in 4G when we log into your bank and do things like that, but also machine to machine. And so those are the three verticals of communications. And horizontally is the areas of technologies. The first layer is called extreme broadband. So that is essentially much faster communications than 4G. And so typically today it's about 2 gigabits per second where it's deployed, but it can go up to 20 gigabits in the future. And so that will enable a lot more things, things like virtual reality and augmented reality, but also much better video calling with much more presence and much more context that will make it easier to do things like we're doing today, but also for relevant to India's fixed wireless. India's penetration of fixed wireless, that is high-speed internet to homes, is very low, only about 8%. And 5G, for example, in the United States is actually used as a home internet service technology. So that may be relevant to India. And of course, there are other applications there too in machine to machine. So high speed is the one part of it. But the other two parts are much more exciting and probably for India more transformative. One is massive machine type communications. massive machine telecommunications, so things like IoT, all kinds of Internet of Things, Internet of Health things, and vehicle communication, vehicle to infrastructure, and also application in Industry 4.0. So this would be pretty impactful. And the bottom layer is, again, an area which is in a very important aspects of 5G is to support ultra reliable and low latency service. Today, on low latency, today, for example, if you press a button on your phone, let's say on a game, by the time it goes into the net and comes back, it can be just only on the radio side, it can be more than 10 milliseconds. That will not work in many real-time applications. You're controlling a tractor or controlling a roadside digger. You'll need a 1 millisecond turnaround time. So that's the low latency part. But also ultra reliability is also important. For example, vehicle-to-vehicle communications to avoid accidents. That will require communication that will always be available, unlike the repetition of wireless. So these layer 3 are really the new dimensions. And I think for India particularly, very, very important, because they will support our infrastructure, because India's infrastructure is quite weak. We know that. And this could be a part of creating a virtual infrastructure for India. So the top layer is, I think, the beginning, but the second two layers will be much more useful. Next slide. So the broad vision of 5G, the next generation mobile network, this is the consortium that some of you may be part of. I mean, they define 5G as follows, and let me read it out. So 5G is an end-to-end ecosystem to enable a fully mobile and a connected society. That's both machines and humans. It empowers value creation, that's very important, to existing and emerging use cases. So the emerging part is the underlying part. And I often say in India that only 1% of 5G use cases is visible today. It will take some years before we develop it fully. And delivered with consistent experience. So that is always a problem with wireless. It's good and bad, but we want something more consistent. And enabled by sustainable business models. So it's enabled the operators who deploy these networks must be able to make money and sustain themselves. Then in 2017-18, there was a forum run by DOT. Mr. Ramachandran was part of it, and somebody else from here, but on this, I think only Mr. Ramachandran from this group. And I just wanted to quote something from the vision of 5G. It was a multi-line statement. I'll just extract something from there. So 5G has the potential for ushering a major societal transformation in India. India must embrace this opportunity by deploying 5G networks early, efficiently, and pervasively, and to make it a truly inclusive technology. So that report is available online, and you're welcome to download it from DOT website. Next slide. So 5G has, I'm going to talk a little bit about various aspects of 5G to give a mostly a global picture at this point. So it has 3 frequency bands. One is called the FR1, or frequency range 1, which is the low frequency bands at like 700 megahertz. It's already used today in 4G. And then the mid frequency bands, which go up to between 3.3, 3.4 to about actually 4.2 gigahertz. So this is called the mid band, or the CBRS band. And this is the band where a lot of deployment is happening today. And then there's another band called FR2, frequency range 2, which starts at 24 gigahertz and goes, there are 2 chunks in US, 28 gigahertz block, and then there's a 39 gigahertz block. These are the licensed band. There's also an unlicensed block at 70 gigahertz. So these are the millimetric band frequencies, and these are called FR2. And there's a little difference in technology here, because the higher frequencies, I'll explain that later. And they, between these 3, between the FR1 and FR2, they cover a variety of applications. Obviously, the very low frequencies are used for large coverage and mainly used for IoT, where you're talking to small sensors or actuators, and they don't have much power, so we need good propagation for those guys. While the mid-band, which is the 3.4 to 3.4 to 4.2, will be really where we will see phones on those bands. A lot of activity will be in these bands. The higher bands will focus on very high density, high throughput applications like stadiums, downtown areas, as well as, for example, fixed access to homes where you need gigabit speeds. So these are frequency bands, and many countries have allocated them. And India's recommendations were made in the DOT report, which the government has accepted. I'm quite not sure about the progress of auctions as yet, but as far as I know, we haven't done it so far. Next slide. So, the development of 5G, of any G, is pretty complicated. It involves the gathering of sometimes thousands of engineers, about 40% of them are often PhDs around the world, every 45 to 60 days. And 5G, the development started with release 13 around 2015, 2016. And the latest release just come out, which is supposed to be out by now, but it's actually delayed by a few months, is release 16. So release 13, 14, 15 mostly focused on enhanced mobile broadband and defined a new radio called 5G NR radio. I'll make some comments on that later. And the release 17 will actually more seriously take on the machine type communications and also the ultra reliable low latency communications. So that has happened. That will start. I think it's already started. That will take another year or so, a year and a half to finish. And deployments started all over the world towards end of 2019, and I'll talk about the status today. But everywhere, what has been deployed is EMBB, which is the enhanced mobile broadband. The MTC and URLLC, that's going to take time because the standard itself is not defined. So I would suspect they'll be at least a year and a half away from today, if not more. Next slide. I should also mention just about the previous slide that this standards effort is a pretty large effort. Thousands of people come for it, and so typically per year, the world spends about $100 million, if not more, in the standard development. Not only the time of the people who actually attend the meetings, but there are lots of people behind these meetings sitting in these companies, whether it's Intel or whether it's Qualcomm, whether it's Huawei, doing all the proposals and simulations. So it's a very big effort. I used to be involved with it some years ago. And so by the time I think 5G gets done, we would have spent something like $800 million just building that stack of many tens of thousands of pages of the standard. So it's a pretty big effort. So what's happening in 5G today? What is deployed is EMBB, Enhanced Mobile Broadband. And it supports phones. We have phones today. There are also MiFi devices, I think it's popular in India, where you jump on 5G to a little puck and you jump out on Wi-Fi. And then, of course, CPEs for fixed access. There are now about 200, putting all these devices, we probably have about 100 devices now, and at least about 15, 20 phones. The peak speed available today, at least in the United States, is in the millimetric band, FR2, and up to 2 gigabit per second. And you can actually see a phone on the bottom there, clocking 1.3 gigabits per second. And I'll talk about the actual phone suppliers later. And the infrastructure is typically, as shown above, the 5G millimetric band radio on which this phone is connecting is actually a very small, GNB, it's called GNB. It's base station. It's in that little yellow ellipse. It's small because at high frequencies, the antennas get very, very small. Even though this antenna, this box has something like 64 antennas, they're so small that fits in a small package. The bigger antennas correspond to the mid-band, the 3.5 gigahertz band. That's just not deployed in US heavily because the spectrum is not yet available. It's occupied by satellites, operators, and I think the Congress has finally moved on it, so there will be auctions end of this year. That will open up another 250 megahertz. And a lot of US deployments will start moving into the mid-band. But one aspect of 5G is not only it's faster, but also it will be much lower cost per bit. That's because these are much wider channels. In fact, the reason why 5G is fast is not because of any particular new technology, just that the channels are much broader. Today in India, we deploy 10 megahertz TDD channels. 5G will support up to 100 megahertz. So in the mid-band, so it's much wider channel. So if India allocates wideband channel, we will get high speed. If we don't do it, we will be still stuck at 4G speeds. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit about the global ecosystem. And it's now deployed in about 40 countries and about 75 carriers. And I think the latest I heard was 80 million subscribers globally, still very small. Today, if you look at the total global subscribers, I think they're about 8.1 billion, more than human population, because many of you, particularly in India, carry multiple phones. But and then just LTE itself is about 2.8, I think about 3.1 billion already. So this is still small, 80 million subscribers, but most of them are in China. China launched 5G in a very big way in the mid-band, FR1 band. And there are, I think, more than 100 cities in China which have already have 5G in it. China has, there are some small cities where it's completely covered by 5G. In bigger cities, it's still coming in, but it's being heavily deployed in China. Even, I would say, maybe a little bit also in kind of pre-5G IoT and so on and so forth. So they are really pushing it a lot. In terms of infrastructure equipment suppliers, these are the usual names. Huawei is the dominant supplier up to 2019. Now there are political issues there. ZTE also, another Chinese company. Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung. So I would put these on the top 5 suppliers, and they probably between themselves hold 95% of the market share. And in general, Huawei is considered to be the most advanced technology, not because all of them are the standard, so nothing is faster and so on and so forth, but actually the flexibility of deployment, ease for which a carrier can adopt it, flexibility in use of frequency bands and so on and so forth. Huawei's put a lot more R&D into it. So they have probably sunk already $30 or $40 billion over the last 5-6 years. And Nokia and Ericsson are also a good market share, but their investments are lower. And Samsung, of course, is trying to catch up, and they already are in India in 4G through Jio. I'm sure they have very big ambitions in 5G too. The other part is semiconductors. These are the chips, and this is everywhere. This is the core where actually the signal processing gets done. And the leaders here are Qualcomm, traditionally the mobile chip maker. And that's the only real company in the United States. Huawei with the semiconductor subsidiary called HiSilicon. So they are also have very strong, very advanced chips. Samsung, of course, and MediaTek, which is a Taiwanese company. So between these 4 companies, they probably have 70% of the world market share. And in terms of actually devices, mainly phones, in US, I see LG and Samsung quite a bit. In China, of course, or outside China, Huawei and Xiaomi, ZTE also have phones. And Motorola, which is has been a very small supplier, actually has a 5G phone. I've not actually checked it. Apple, which is the big name here, has still not announced a 5G phone. It should come anytime now. So this is broadly the global ecosystem status. Next slide. So R&D. So this is important because these require massive investments, and The core technology of 5G is same as 4G. It's called MIMO OFDMA, and so I was involved with this technology right from the beginning, back to the 1990s. And in fact, from my original work, WiMAX used that technology, and LTE actually departed a little bit on OFDMA. They used something called single carrier OFDMA, but that's been taken away. So 4G has gone back, 5G has gone back to the original MIMO OFDMA. The development of 5G started around 2004. And the total amount of engineers is, actually I revised these numbers, it's probably more than 120,000, probably closer to 200,000 R&D engineers. And about 40% of those are PhDs, or 30%. And in compare my companies, I would something 50% were PhDs here in the United States. And investment per year, I think the numbers are higher than 10 billion, I think closer to 25 billion per year. The total investment in information technology, information and communication technology is about 250 billion per year globally. 5G probably I thought was 5%, but actually probably 10% of that. So it's about 25 billion per year. It's hard to actually count it because a lot of overlap between 5G and other technologies. And I mentioned to you, we do about $100 million a year on standard development. Just by the way, on investments in 5G, India's 25 billion a year is the 5G investment globally. India's investment in all R&D, that is in all segments, not only ICT, but in materials and automation and industry, government and public-private sector is about 12.5 billion per year. So 5G investment globally is actually more than the total of India's investment in R&D. And the all important issues about intellectual property. So when we build these standards, the key things all these companies try and do is to try and get patents accepted as essential patents for the technology. So when you hold those SEPs, so standard essential patents, then when anybody builds these boxes, they'll have to pay you royalty. So this is a huge race, and this is why so many people get involved with it. So the leader here is Huawei. Yeah, probably 45% of SEPs of 5G are owned by Huawei. Qualcomm, Samsung, ZTE, and others are also SEP holders. So it's a very massive effort around the world. Next slide. So let me finish. We're still early in 5G in terms of, certainly in terms of standard development, because we haven't done the release, we haven't finished release 16 and release 17 yet to come. So only the enhanced broadband part is now complete. The other two segments will take another year and a half. So by the time 5G becomes really matures, probably 4 or 5 years away, this is the numbers globally. And it's generally considered to be of enormous transformation potential. And I would say actually much more for India, because it can support, help increase our vulnerability from infrastructure. We have been building infrastructure, and in the last few years we've done very well, but we still have a long way to go when we compare ourselves to the developed countries. So this can help bridge that gap quickly. So this is why DOT was very keen that something should be done here. And as I mentioned, all the application we will see is still to be invented. So it'll take time. And this is actually the area where India can excel, to look at applications, particularly those are particularly relevant to India, and build industry to develop them. So it's a big leapfrog opportunity for India, and we should seize it. So it's a very important technology. So with that, I will conclude and pass back my the webinar to Mr. Mehta. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think you have given a very broad sweep of how the 5G environment is unfolding before us, and the manner in which this technology can completely change our experience with what we are seeing today in terms of telephones, in terms of videos, in terms of data sharing, in terms of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, the Internet of Things. All this is going to change considerably. Before we move on, and because I see everyone else who will be speaking in the panel is from the technology side, let me pose some questions, perhaps because it would be important to see the other aspects of 5G too, which are not technology, but which have a tremendous impact on the structure of, for instance, the society, how social structures will be responding to this rapid change or leapfrogging into the next generation of technology. For instance, the question of digital divide in India. Today, we are seeing the impact already where with the lockdown, those who are better off, well off, or who have access to technology, their children are getting online education. Even Zoom is being used and other technologies are being used. But a very, very large number of students, I would say close to 70% of the students, especially those in the rural areas, etc., are deprived of it. And they are going to miss out on this period where the others are going to benefit from it. And in India, where I would say around 150 million people, according to a very well-researched paper produced by Dr. Ratin Roy, about 150 million people can be called truly the consumer class, and the rest, almost 900 million people, are not yet there. So we'll need to see how the digital divide is going to increase, whether this digital inequality would also then result in a spillover in economic inequality increasing. Already we have seen if you've seen Piketty's work in the last 20 years, inequalities have grown all over the world. And one of the reasons of this, the growth in inequality is also the technology. And increasingly, economic activities are underpinned by technology and the changing technologies. And these are changing the structure of wealth and how people can, how wealth is created and how wealth is distributed. And therefore, we need to also see how, because the question here would be, if we are going to have 5G and if we are going to be looking at regulation of 5G, these questions for policymakers will have tremendous importance. Also in terms of employability of people. I mean, how would people, especially in a country like India, where asymmetrical education, quality of education imparted is asymmetrical, and we are yet to move into that high level of a broad spectrum education across the board. How would employability be impacted by more and more use of technology? Because 5G is going to make it much more easy for more sophisticated ways of doing business. We were just before the start of this meeting, we were discussing how the work from home is going to become the norm and how people are going to start working from home, and how that is going to impact the employability of people in a country like India, where access to high quality technology itself is a question. My second very fundamental question on this is the impact on liberal democracy. We are already seeing there has been a shift across all the countries, including the United States and Europe, in Latin America, even in India for that matter. There has been a shift away from liberal democracy. And the question of state surveillance, the question of mind manipulation, especially in terms of elections, we have seen even today a country like United States, the debate over the manipulation of election process by Russia of the presidential election has not been settled. And this manipulation is by use of technology. Obviously, it is not by going and capturing the polling booths, but it is through technology. So how mind manipulation will increase state power, and that also would have an impact on privacy. The question of privacy is still open. There is a lot of discussion on how much the state is going to start getting into our private lives, and centralization. We have already seen this. Now, one ration card, it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But one nation, one ration card, we are talking about direct transfers. So central government scheme money should be directly transferred into, if the payments have to be done to the people. So the states can be, you can leapfrog over states. Federalism is coming under severe strain. And this is all because technology is playing a very important role in this. Of course, how much it will lead us towards authoritarianism. It seems like such an irony, but what George Orwell said about Big Brother watching in his book 1984 seems to be becoming true in 2020. I mean, just about 30 years later than what he had predicted. So I think these questions are very important. And while technology is, and we must discuss what are the implications of 5G on India in terms of technology and how much it can change things. But I would urge all of you who are in the realm of technology also to step back a bit and also consider how these questions will be answered. I'll stop here and I'll request Ms. Kirti Gupta to come in and make her intervention. Thank you. You'll have to unmute yourself, I think.
Yeah, does this work?
Yes, it does.
All right, thank you so much. Udai, I would like to share a presentation if that's possible. Would you mind giving me the ability to share a PowerPoint on this meeting, or?
My only request will be that the panelists will have to contain themselves to 10 minutes each, because the time is going to be short. So let's just try and keep it within that period.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I'd prepared a set of slides, but I'll just try to speak for it. And I would love to address the question that you had raised for the panel. So I think it's good to start though from the initial question that, Udai mentioned coming out of the survey. This general question about, is 5G an incremental step? Is it just faster 4G, or is it something entirely different? And then we should talk about the implications, the social implications that you mentioned, Mr. Mayaram. And ultimately, I think we should discuss, as the panel description suggested, what are the policies that India should be looking for implementing to embrace 5G, to be a leader in 5G, or to, ignore 5G and move on, should India choose to do that. So let me start from the very beginning. I think Dr. Paulraj covered a really broad and detailed introduction to 5G technology as relevant for this panel. So I think I would just like to echo that from us, coming from the wireless industry, I think I didn't introduce myself. I've been at Qualcomm for over 18 years. I started working at Qualcomm doing wireless systems design and standards after graduate school in electrical engineering. And I like to joke that, at some point then I turned to the dark side and did a PhD in economics, and now lead our IP and antitrust policy. So I think that, looking at 5G from both sides, right, from the technology and from the policy side, it's not incremental from either of those perspectives. So let's talk about the technology for a second, right? If 1G to 4G was a race to overcome some of the fundamental technical challenges of wireless communications with the goal of connecting people to people, connecting you to me, 5G isn't just another G, just another generation. It's really a paradigm shift because it's now not only about connecting people to people, but it's about connecting everything everywhere. In that way, it was designed to be a universal fabric of connectivity. And those of us at Qualcomm who do this for a living, right? We call ourselves the Bell Labs of wireless communications. When we were thinking about whether it's worth working in another G, it was only worthwhile, with this new content revolution. It was only worthwhile to work in another generation and put like fundamental resources there if it was going to be a paradigm shift. And in that way, I think the use cases that 5G will enable are well beyond simply high broadband or simply high data rates. So, I prepared some visual presentation just to share with you, and I can share with everybody later after this webinar, just to show you that, when the industry came together and said, okay, what are the requirements? What is it that defines 5G? We actually thought of three fundamental pillars, and those three fundamental pillars drive the requirements, drives the social impact that you were discussing, and will drive, the policy decisions that face India. So let's talk about those very briefly. The first is ultra high data rates. Indeed, much higher data rates than 4G, but we are talking, gigabits per second in your homes, which enable use cases that never before envisioned. So, we have really nice simulations here where we show you, downloading a video or streaming something on your screen. It takes minutes, but we're talking about under seconds in 5G. So that was one, and that enables scenarios like, really truly using augmented and virtual reality platforms like you never could because of so much more delay and, interruptions in the way you view virtual data, virtual audio. So that imagine in a, post-COVID pandemic world, really transforming education, industry, workplaces. Second requirement is ultra low delay latency, which we call, and ultra high reliability. So I'm talking sending a packet from one part of the world to another under a millisecond. That's a flash of a camera. In that time, you can send information from point A to point B. And ultra high reliability, which is 99.69999999%, which means that you won't see a packet loss in a factory floor setting maybe more than in one, a machine operating over 24 hours. So you won't have the kinds of, downtimes and accidents or lost information, which really allow you to automate parts of industrial, which we call industrial IoT, industrial factory floors, farms, etc., that you just couldn't with 4G or with Wi-Fi, with any other wireless connectivity, because that wired was more reliable. This enables factories to save enormous amounts of money not because of lower workforce, because it's a smarter workforce, but because of reducing the downtimes, right? Like if you're reconfiguring a factory floor, like automakers have often told us this, that they, lose days, and that's, several hundreds or thousand units of cars a day when they're reconfiguring their floors and rewiring their floors. Now, if everything can be done wirelessly and everything can be communicated wirelessly, that downtime is significantly reduced or gone. The third requirement was, what I was, suggesting to you, connecting everything everywhere. So massive Internet of Things, deep, dense networks. So I eventually think about a paradigm shift, right? Not just when I send something to you, my phone is sending a signal, a packet to a antenna or a base station, which is then sending it, forwarding it to you. So it's a centralized method of communication. Imagine moving to a distributed method of communication where I send something to somebody near me, they send something to you, and you're creating self-organizing networks. And when you have deep, massive Internet of Things where everything is connected everywhere, you need different network architectures. All of those are envisioned features, requirements of defining 5G. So when we think about 5G as a technology, we think about these fundamental paradigm shifts, and Dr. Paulraj can give you a lecture on why these are fundamentally technically difficult science challenges. But moving on from that, it enables use cases that we could never imagine before, right? We talked about the AR, VR type of use cases. We talked about factories and IoT. We can talk about other things, right? Like imagine you're sitting in a stadium, you can stream video or of a game from any angle that you like. Imagine that your smart home is connected, your smart factories are connected. Imagine smart agriculture, crop monitoring, livestock monitoring. All of those innovations are happening today, and I'll circulate some materials that show you some of these very specific use cases and enormous number of startups entering these specific use cases to create a revolution. And we in India can choose to embrace it or to wait, but I frankly don't think that we can afford to, right? The kind of economic impact, and there are reports that exist on the estimated economic impact of 5G, because it's not only going to transform just the regular wireless mobile industry, the phones and the infrastructure and the chips, but everything. 17, 18 different industries are already poised to start taking advantage of 5G. And many others are going to follow, right? I call it the airwaves, the waterways, and the roads of tomorrow, because everything is going to communicate over a network, a system that is designed to connect everything. So ultimately, it's going to happen. It's going to happen sooner or later. And in fact, in India, it's already happening. We expect expecting rollouts in 2020, 2021. There are worldwide, there are over 100 operators, over 100 OEMs, phone makers that have launched 5G or are planning to launch 5G in 2020. So in the traditional mobile space, 5G is already happening. In the other industries, in IoT, manufacturing, enterprises, your offices, schools, hospitals connected to localized 5G networks, it is going to happen. And then ultimately, cars and transportation, etc. Where does India fit into all this? I think India has a tremendous opportunity in two ways. Let's talk about the use cases first, and let's talk about the industry next. In terms of use cases, remember that India is actually a poster child example of a country that leapfrogged, that didn't just have to wait for 1G and then 2G and slog its way through 3G and 4G. India could leapfrog into embracing the most recent generations of wireless, the Gs, which actually have been enormously impactful in closing the digital divide, right? Like there are, as an economist, I've read and studied and written papers of, farmers in remote locations or fishermen who could, get real-time information about markets and prices and transform the way they do business, right? Because they are suddenly now connected. Villages are now connected. And you really asked an important question, is 5G going to increase or close the digital divide? Because that's a question we're asking in the United States too, right? In the post-pandemic world, we are trying to think of, broadband stimulus packages, and we are thinking of how to spend that money. And we are thinking of, is 5G a real value proposition for rural areas? And, I'm doing papers as we speak, studies as we speak right now to understand the cost difference, right? Like if you have, imagine a rural home or a rural hospital, and you are trying to decide whether I connect that remote location wired in a wired way, like through fiber, or wirelessly, either through, wireless, fixed access wireless or wireless backhaul. it's actually much cheaper to connect it wirelessly, and cheaper still to have, low range millimeter wave antennas connecting you to the rest of the world. So for remote rural areas, 5G actually has a stronger value proposition than any other G ever did before. And also think about it this way, right? Imagine I'm trying to think about a rural area as an operator and saying, I want to put a 4G antenna. I'm saying, you guys will get 100 megabits per second, and you, the local hospital, the local school, and the local 3 businesses will have to share that speed. Now 5G comes and I say, you know what, guys, you can share few gigabits per second between all of you. That means much higher data rates, actually usable data rates for these businesses or these hospitals and schools to use. Suddenly the value proposition with 5G is much higher for similar amounts of investment. So I think that,
Kirti, 1
5G.
minute left.
Okay. Now, quickly, let me move to the industry, right? I think for use cases, there may be a much higher potential than we imagine. Industry in India needs to change, right? I mean, I have some data to share with you that show that, there are 2 kinds of things that are happening in the wireless world. One is the foundational layer, which, we at Qualcomm have done for a long time, Ericsson, Nokia, and others, the R&D layer, right? Where everything sits upon that, going to standards, putting your IP there and investing in like long-term technologies. India is almost non-existent in those areas, IITs, and, I have specific data, and I'm, going to write a paper on this, publish a paper on this, which show you the like 0.2% of, overall contributions coming from Indian institutions. So we need to up our game there, and that means better incentives to do long-term R&D. And second is to become a higher value add leader in the mobile manufacturing value chain. So, with all this buzz and talk about Make in India, yes, there is improvement to move from assemblers to true manufacturers, whether it's chips or phones or infrastructure, but there is really low progress. As Dr. Paul mentioned, infrastructure, there are only 4 players, Samsung, Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei. India doesn't have, any player there. Chips, we don't have foundries. Phones, we have, assemblers of semi and fully knocked down kits imported from China. But that is the place where I think we can really, more easily climb up the value chain quickly to become true legit manufacturers and then ultimately innovators. I'll stop here. I think that India has immense potential to be a leader in the 5G race, both as an industry player and as a user. And I hope that we'll continue this discussion.
Thank you, Kirti. As mentioned in the beginning, Dr. Mayaram had to leave for a medical emergency at his end, so I'll take it over from here. So I think very interesting insights, Kirti, and please do share your slides so we can then send it across to all the participants. So given the positive time, I'll quickly move to the next speaker, Mr. Vikram Tiwathia. And I think taking the clue from what Kirti mentioned that there is, and she did give a run-up of what is the potential of 5G and the use cases. My question to you is, what progress have Indian cellular companies made towards the launch and operation of 5G in India? And would you think, are there any policy or regulatory challenges which would come in the way of expediting the launch of 5G in India? Vikram, you have 5 to 7 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Udai and Kirti and Dr. Paulraj for setting the context. So, as being at COAI, we've got actually the pulse, we read the pulse of both the government and the operators as to where we are at present, and, what is the topic, whether it's a myth or a reality, and where are we headed. And Udai, to your point about, what the survey said. So the interesting part is, I'll just begin by qualifying on what Arvind Mayaram said. If there is one sector in India that has actually enhanced the quality of life and services for individuals, it is the telecom sector. Because you've been able to provide services into the hands of individual people, right? Now, that is a very empowering part. And, well, you can always call it a digital divide or a have or have not. But the fact is, today, this year, we are celebrating 25 years of mobility in India, which was initially spearheaded by TV Ramachandran, our ex DG COI, and compliments to you, TV, for having led the charge right for all these 25 years and being here on the panel. Now, coming to the value proposition that India has of 5G, right? Now, the fact you have to, what does 5G do? I'll just build up on what Kirti says, that if you're able to move data around and convert that data into a service and an intelligence and a value proposition. If I'm getting cheaper apples coming in from New Zealand, where I have apples growing in Himachal Pradesh, what can I do to make India more competitive, right? And here is a technology that is available to make that, to make India more competitive, not just in growing apples, but across the board. So whether it's logistics or aviation or manufacturing or automation of industries. So if India is a very big country for auto components, it is a very bright case for auto component industry at the shop floor level for automation using whether it is the MTC, what Dr. Paulraj said, or Internet of Things, and of course, enhanced mobile broadband. So the question is, does India as a country recognize the value proposition that 5G will bring? Initially, this government did lay a good start with Digital India, because what it did was telecom in India being a central subject. The plug-in by states was not as much. So with the Digital India program, the states were encouraged to use more digitization and enhance their productivity, right? And the good part is that we worked with the government to make a broadband readiness index of states. So when you do a happening Haryana or you do amazing Bengal, out there you'll be projected, where do you stand in the broadband readiness index? So if a cycle manufacturer or an apple producer or a food processing guy wants to invest in that state, where at that meeting, they would ask, what is the kind of digital infrastructure do you have? Which will make setting up an establishment in that state, more cost competitive. So this is a good part that has happened. The other part is recognizing. Now, if you see which are the countries that have actually launched or invested in 5G. So it is the country is making an investment. And to your point today, it is not just restricted to the telecom operators anymore, because 5G is a national imperative. It is not a business imperative for telcos, but it is for countries to recognize how do you want to actually use technology to provide services to your people, plus, rise up in the scale of competitiveness amongst, the nation, different countries, okay? So with that, I'll just as a pointer, would GST have happened? Would direct cash transfers have happened? UPI today is the most convenient and the best international practice for money transfers. Now, all this was enabled and leveraged by the government to provide services to common people using technology, and that too on the back of mobile broadband, right? Now the case is to extend this to everything, okay? So the good part was there was momentum initially, as Dr. Paulraj, alluded to, the 5G high-level forum. The government put in a lot of effort. All of us from the industry worked and came out with a report announced by the minister. Then there's the National Digital Communication Policy of 2018. That initial momentum has slowed down. So that momentum has to be picked up, and where the countries are racing forward, Kirti, as you're aware, that FCC has auctioned, because initially FCC lagged behind in making spectrum available, but they have taken a fast track, and the FCC chairman has emphasized, and they have auctioned spectrum all across bands. Initially it was just 26, but mid-band they made a auction 26. There's 31, and I'm told to talk of 47. Similarly, other countries, New Zealand made it free. Okay. And if you see in the country, the new realization, or actually people have realized the importance of broadband networks, particularly further enhanced in this, COVID situation. To that, what I will come is, what is India's, ability to leverage? So if we do not have manufacturing of equipment hardware, right? But what are our strengths? Our strengths are in using data to make new use cases. If we are the hotbed or the center of software expertise, right? Indian engineers and Indian software people, can you build many services which would be used over 5G? Because ultimately 5G will enable the movement of data up and down, provided that sector is digitized. So what are the services that you can make for the country, not just for the country, but for global services, right? Anybody deploying 5G, what is the service model that I can offer is one thing which is good for us. Now, the question, Udai, you posed was Indian telcos and 5G readiness. So the good part I can say is, if you see Tarang Sanchar, that is the national portal where every base station is added. For the last 2 years or so, we were adding like 1,000 base stations every day, 30,000 a month. And today we have 2.2 million base stations, right? And 77% of this is 4G. Means because 4G will provide a segue to 5G. In fact, India, that way, much more faster decision making has to take place if you have to really, make 5G a reality. Because while the report, which was chaired by Dr. Paulraj and NDCP, the conversion of those reports into actual executive actions, making spectrum available, making right-of-way permissions available. So it is happening, but the question is at what pace? So the pace of that has to be significantly enhanced, because the countries that you see which are up ahead in deployment of 5G have taken decisions because they think this is a national imperative. There is a requirement to enhance competitiveness of the country. So that is something which requires more attention here within the country. The other aspect I would say is, the standardization part, which Dr. Paulraj alluded. It is very important for us in India to deploy globally harmonized standards. And that will enable the networks to be deployed with global scale and harmonization. So that is something which is of great importance, so to say. And as far as the telecom operators in India go, to your question, yes, all our members are very keen to deploy 5G and to leverage 5G and provide multitude of services to the people, so that because of the lack of available investable funding, whether it's for creating healthcare facilities or education or transportation or manufacturing. So this technology will actually enable India to become more competitive. Important part is timely decision making and making the resources for that available, and the primary resources being spectrum at an affordable cost, right of ways at affordable costs and timing, and of course the rest. I don't know if you're following what the cost of recommended reserve prices were, but the fact of the matter is the last few auctions, only about 30% or 40% of the spectrum on offer got picked up. And much of it got picked up only because, your hands were tied behind your back. So, I mean, these are important decisions. The government has to make available, and both, it is very important that across the industries, we have to work and collaborate, because collaboration is the key to leveraging 5G to enhance this competitiveness. I'll leave it at that, and we'll be happy to take some more questions.
Thank you, Vikram. I think very well points, and I think one of your important points regarding building India's own competitiveness, and also that links to this clarion call by the Prime Minister, which is Atmanirbharta. I think it falls in really well in place. So moving ahead to the next panelist, Mr. TV Ramachandran. So I think I'll just take the clue from where Vikram had left, that we need to move with the right pace to take the right decisions. So my question to you, TV, is that is India ready for 5G? And do you think that there are India-centric use cases that will commercially be available and viable for consumer demand level? Over to you, TV.
Thank you. Thanks, Udai. Respected Professor Arvind Paulraj, Emeritus Professor at Stanford, and also member of the US Hall of Fame. Respected Dr. Arvind Mayaram, he's left, of course, early. And great friend, Mr. Udai Mehta, Executive Director, CUTS, and co-panelists, Madam Kirti Gupta, Mr. Vikram Tiwathia, and Mr. Deepak Maheshwari. Distinguished attendees, I would like to, first of all, express my heartfelt thanks to Udai and CUTS for giving me this opportunity to share some views, and that too at a forum which has the distinction of having one of the world's greatest experts on 5G, the famous Professor Paulraj, as the keynote speaker. I had the privilege of serving on the high-level forum which he was driving. He was a driving force of the government high-level force for 5G. And I cannot do better than to start with my warm salutations to the professor and to request him to pardon me if there are any errors in my understanding of 5G, which I will express today. I've been instructed very strictly by Udai to confine myself to answering to two questions. That's a very clear mail sent to me. And the questions are, is India ready for 5G, which is pointed out? What about India-centric use cases, which will be commercially viable? Is it premature for 5G to be rolled out at this stage, given that 4G is still at a nascent stage and parts of India are still reliant on 2G and 3G? Secondly, how will Atmanirbharta impact the rollout of 5G? Udai, you have not been fair to me at all. Both questions are extremely complex issues, difficult to answer, and not only because of the techno-economic aspect, but because of the powerful geopolitical issues involved. Faced with this tough situation, I'm tempted almost to follow the sage counsel of the famous, brilliant US Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, who advised that do not ever answer the question posed to you. Answer the question which you would have liked to be asked of you. So I could do that, but Udai being an old young friend, I cannot go against what he has requested. So my endeavor would be to answer honestly and to the best of my ability and knowledge in this area. Taking the first question, whether we are ready, answer is somewhat ambivalent. With all due respect to what the earlier speakers have spoken about, I would say that from my point of view, it's a very strong yes for 5G today. If you're talking about immediate rollout of private and campus networks or LAN networks. But for the second part, I would say it's a bit difficult, challenging for macro, circle-wide and nationwide networks. You might be puzzled by this, but I can give you 6 specific reasons why there are challenges. But at the same time, I'd say India has been great in always resolving challenges. We always have had great challenges right from the 2G days, and we've been overcoming them one by one. 6 challenges for wide area networks of 5G are fiber. It's well accepted, and Dr. Paulraj has been indicating also that we must have at least 80% of the towers fiberized if we're going to use 5G. Unfortunately, in India, we are still up to only about 25–30% best of towers fiberization. So we need to move fast there. Secondly, download capability. Ultimately, everywhere you need huge download capability, not just depend upon mobile networks. And there again, we are slightly at a disadvantage that we are far below the global average. I find that in India, we are at about 236 Wi-Fi hotspots per million pop. The world average is nearly 200 times higher at 46,410 hotspots per million pop. Public domain data available on iPass. Spectrum available. Much has been said about spectrum by Professor Paulraj and Vikram, and I think Kirti also. I would only say that spectrum allocation today in India is far below the desired level. For example, the amount of 5G spectrum indicated for us is only about 175 megahertz totally, which is less than 1/3 of what US is having. And 175 megahertz means, and that too in the mid-range band, that means with 4 operators, you can hope for 40 megahertz per operator, 20 up, 20 down, and probably 1800 would serve that better, because 1800 will have more coverage power, carrying power. So we have got a challenge there. Quickly, we need more spectrum. Thirdly, price of spectrum is today several fold higher than other countries. And I'm talking here with hard data available and without just comparing absolute numbers. Because if you compare absolute numbers, it will seem even higher. But applying the correction for ARPU, the normal purchase power parity does not apply because it's not an off-the-shelf item. It can be only bought by telecom operators from the government. So the right thing is the purchasing power of the telcos, which is decided with the ARPU. And applying those corrections and for the POP, I find it's at least 4 times higher. And that's going to be a huge challenge in this current situation. Fifthly, millimetric waves, which Professor Paulraj rightly emphasized. That's absolutely essential for having the high data carrying capacity. And that's not yet on the cards for release for allocation. There's no recommendation, no plan for auction of that. Sixthly, use cases. On top of all these resource challenges, I'm afraid there have been no real trials yet of use cases in India, 5G use cases. And the opinion of experts and the opinion of the high-level government forum was you need at least 6 to 9 months of intensive field trialing to see the commercial viability, establish, fine-tune the cases. We can't afford to go just headlong into it without testing it. So that's again a challenge. Keeping these in mind, I would say that these large macro networks, widely distributed networks, will take a little time. It's not immediately available. We have to do. But coming to the next point, the private networks, they are definitely on because these aspects don't pose challenges for private networks. If we talk about campus, IITs or research institutions or an AIIMS hospital or factories. I was recently in a seminar, NASCOM seminar, I was speaking in where they wanted it was all 90% of the audience was manufacturing, and they wanted to know when 5G can come to them for productivity, for efficiency, cost reduction. And that we can do even today. So there is no hassle there. We can deploy private networks for all these healthcare, for education, research, factories. And India needs manufacturing efficiencies in a big way if we are going to take care of the current geopolitical opportunities. So there, I think we can start going. In fact, I would say this is one of the biggest opportunities before us. In fact, as per KPMG, 5G will be a boon to the economy, although the revenue generated in the initial stages by wireless carriers from the emerging technology would be rather modest. And they have estimated, KPMG, that increased spending on connectivity, hardware, software, and so it could drive more than $140 billion of annual revenues worldwide by 2023. KPMG predicts, however, that only about 11% of the spending will go to connectivity, balance 90% will go to all these, what I refer to as private networks initially. These are serious possibilities above us. We next go on to think, how do we set up these private networks? I think this is a big opportunity. telcos, for example, could help set up these private networks for all these entities, whether it's a Hero Honda, whether Maruti Suzuki, Toyota, they would love to have it. And telcos could provide them, they could provide to AIMS, provide to educational institutions, but not just confined to telcos. We could, in my view, this should be made available opportunity for all, because private entities should be able to set up on their own also. You don't need a license because the private network is not interconnected to the PSTN. That being the case, there are no security hazards, no other issues. You should be able to have them on a standalone basis, like a captive CUG network. So that is a huge opportunity before us. And such private networks could use things like what my friend Vikram referred to. Recently, FCC released 1200 megahertz in 6 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi 6 and others. And that sort of thing could eminently meet this requirement. Your next question, Udai, was, is it premature for 5G? Whether we are jumping in too early, can we wait? And of course, Kirti said you can leapfrog. I would say that the answer is this type of thinking that the market will wait for us is, I think, rather suicidal. Markets remind me of physics. Nature abhors a vacuum. Like that, markets abhor a vacuum. If there is a need, and there is a need in India today, if somebody doesn't jump in fully, markets don't wait, they move on. So we have to do that, because this is a mistake which was made for 4G. We thought 3G could do for a couple of years more, 2-3 years more. And we were proven sadly wrong. 4G came in, really disrupted the market because consumers lapped it up. Indians love technology. Time and again, Indians have demonstrated their penchant for technology. So we have to take that into consideration. We are not premature for 5G. Going on to the second question about Atmanirbharta.
TV,
1
minute.
1 minute? Yeah,
1 minute.
Sure, because it's a very short answer. From BIF, we completely support the government policy of Atmanirbharta, 100%. And yes, India could get adversely impacted in the short term, both in terms of delayed rollout as well as equipment costs, if we have to go strictly by this. But I think there is a golden opportunity here to take a balanced approach and apply the law of proportionality to the risk factor involved for component, because we depend a lot on component. Components are used everywhere in every country from areas of concern. So we should look at a holistic view, a balanced view, and go forward, but utilize this opportunity. Due to the COVID delays, 5G is getting delayed everywhere. We should use this opportunity to get India in the manufacturing map of the world. I think this is a golden opportunity. I would stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, TV. I think the point, what was raised by you and also by Vikram, is the emphasis on manufacturing in India. And I'm sure we can have a complete different webinar on what are the issues when it comes to adding value and manufacturing in India. But taking the clue from your point about whether are we ready, and as you rightfully said, that the market will not wait and it is going to be suicidal. So my question to Mr. Deepak Maheshwari from that perspective would be that does the current financial position of the India's telecom sector companies allow them to make investments in the buying of the 5G spectrum? And when do you think would the same be auctioned? Over to you, Mr. Deepak.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for that. And so being the last, perhaps a lot has already been spoken, what I could have spoken or wanted to speak. But nevertheless, thanks for this opportunity. Now, when we are looking at is India ready for this type of deployment in terms of especially the telcos readiness? And as was mentioned earlier by both TV as well as by Vikram, I think one major challenge is that the telcos in India are under heavy debts. And over the past few years and months, we have seen this massive consolidation in the market. That's one aspect. But at the same time, everybody, whether it's the public sector telcos or the private sector telcos, everybody's bleeding. And their total debt on the industry is actually rising quarter by quarter, month after month. And in that scenario, to expect these telcos to shell out huge reserve prices, and on top of that, of course, bid I'm sure that the government expects them to bid beyond the reserve prices, not just stop at the reserve prices. I think that's a rather an unfair and undesirable thing to do. Yes, the Supreme Court did mention in 2012 that the natural resources like spectrum should be auctioned. But that does not mean that we need to set a very high reserve price, number one. Number two, it doesn't even mean that we need to have a reserve price in the first place. So, for example, India could also try out an auction, at least as a test case, without any reserve price. Of course, you'll have to have safeguards around the competition issues because the number of operators is less. So you need to have safeguards against those type of possible collusion. But at the same time, there's a possibility to do without that. And one specific point is this. The last auction, which happened in 2016, as Vikram mentioned, only 40% of spectrum was picked up in that. And interestingly, the 700 megahertz, there was not a single bidder for that. And if we are looking at the rural rollout and many other things that was mentioned earlier, the 700 megahertz gives us an enormous coverage. Of course, it may not give you a very high bandwidth because the channels are quite narrow there, but 700 megahertz gives us more enormous coverage. And that's the one particular area that we should look at in terms of doing this auction. Now, one possibility could be to look at the unlicensed spectrum, as was mentioned by TV earlier. So, for example, FCG just about 3 months back, they did this 1200 megahertz in the 6 gigahertz unlicensed. And it is not that it is all unlicensed. So there'll be licensed operator, but there'll also be unlicensed operation. And as was mentioned by Mr. Ajit Pai, unlicensed operation at this point of time in the 6 gigahertz, they are permitted only for indoor or in-campus usage, which actually ties back very well with what TV was mentioning just a few minutes back. The second aspect is obviously you also have other type of technologies like Wi-Fi 6 and many others, which could also be used along with the small cell networks of what is being mentioned in terms of 5G. But beyond all these things, I think two things are important for us to notice. Number one, way back in May 2004, then telecom minister who had just taken over on that day mentioned that India was going to skip 3G and we'll migrate to 4G. Never happened. We actually went to 3G and then of course we had to go for 4G. Today we are talking about 5G, and I'm sure that yes, we should do 5G. But as was mentioned by Professor Paulraj right in the beginning, that the development of 5G started way back in 2004, and the first deployment started happening in 2019. So there was a 15 years lag during this time. I'm sure as and when 6G comes, it won't be a 16 years gap at that point of time. It is going to be much compressed. At the same time, in 2G, India had absolutely no say. In 3G, we just started sort of making a little quibbles here and there. Okay, this should be there, that should be there. In 4G, a little bit more, some contribution from India. In 5G, yes, LMLC has been accepted as one of the candidates in terms of large coverage and limited mobility. But I think when it comes to something like in future, as was mentioned earlier also by Kirti and others, when we are looking at not just manufacturing, but also in terms of development, we should look at not, as was mentioned by the famous coach, don't just look at where the puck is, but also look at where the puck is going to be. So yes, 5G is now and here. I think that's something that we need to embrace and we need to work and go on with it. But beyond that, we should look at 6G and other type of technologies also as they are unfolding in future. And the other aspect is that this concept of India-centric use cases, I think what we need to look at is, instead of saying India-centric use cases, what we need to look at is India-relevant use cases, which are also scalable and may find application around the world, especially in the global south. So whatever we develop in India in terms of education, healthcare, agriculture, etc., with little bit of tweaks here and there, would also find huge amount of uptake even in Africa, or for that matter in Latin America and elsewhere. Vikram did mention about the payment side. So I just want to mention one data point. A few years back, the number of digital transactions digital payment transactions in India was 6 per capita per annum. And last month, in the month of June, we had just single month, we had 1 digital transaction per capita in 1 month. So from 6 in a year, which is about 0.5 in the whole year, we already have a situation of 1 in a month, which is almost like 1 to a huge multiple here. And I think those are the type of things that we also need to embrace much more. And the second thing is, in terms of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, Internet of Things, etc., we also need to look at what is it that we can do here, which is not necessarily only about high-speed download, which of course TV did mention, but also about high-speed upload. Because it's, I think with 5G and cloud computing and AI, increasingly the web is going to be more symmetric rather than asymmetric. So the type of speeds that we need to look at is not only in terms of the download speed, but also in terms of upload speeds. Because, for example, if you are going to do a robotic surgery or let's say even a live video conferencing like this, you need a almost symmetric type of situation in terms of the traffic management on the network. So I would just like to stop here, and maybe we can have questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak ji. I think 2 important points which I do take away from your interventions. I think one interesting point was regarding the reserve price and the fact that you may not need to have a reserve price, and while we keep safeguarding competition. I think that's going to be an interesting research topic. And I think the second important point you spoke about scalability. And I think your point is very well noted that rather than talking about India-centric cases, I think it should be India-relevant cases with the opportunity to take it beyond India and across the borders and the boundaries next to India. I think with that, I'll now take the floor, and we do have several questions from the participants. I quickly wanted to just check with all the speakers. I know we've already touched 8:30. If we could just take it beyond 10 more minutes, would that be fine with all the speakers?
Okay.
Yes, it's okay.
Sure, thank you very much. So very quickly, the first question is for Professor Paulraj from Mr. Anupam Khanna. And the question is, what is the scope of ultra low-cost devices and phones with limited features? Is anyone developing these around the world? Professor Paulraj.
Will you just repeat that question? Ultra low power?
Sure, I'll just repeat that. What is the scope of ultra low-cost devices and phones with limited features? Is anyone developing those around the world?
Right. So I think perhaps Kirti will be a better person to answer that question. But in general, the cost of semiconductors is the key part of these systems. And we have a lot of volume in semiconductors, prices will fall. So there will be a lot of price erosion. And I think already smartphones, 4G smartphones are incredibly cheap in India. So 5G, maybe in the millimetric band, will take a little more time to get there because these devices are still new. And Qualcomm, for example, is a major supplier here. But in the mid-band, I think the prices should touch 4G prices very quickly. So I think the affordability of 5G devices would be pretty good. But India must first, of course, launch the service. Today, I want to sort of take a little aside and say a couple of things. One is, like many of you, including Kirti, pointed out, 5G is a very different technology with huge number of applications for India. And the Indian government has to take some initiative to make it happen in different ways. Of course, getting spectrum allocated in auction, the regulatory support. There's so many things the government has to do and must do. So I think these were all decided upon in 2018, but follow-up has been difficult, and particularly we now have another crisis on our hands. But another comment I would make generally to the Indian audience is that I've been in India in 2019 about 6 or 7 times, or maybe more, meeting at with the Prime Minister's office and the PM also. But not on 5G, but on a broader issue of core information technology. In fact, India has to build capability there. But in general, what I come across is that, and this is the same almost every government in the world, but more so in India, is that the understanding of technology and, for example, understanding of value of 5G is always difficult. And certainly, I think one thing we have to do in India is to communicate better with our top civil servants and carry them with us, because what I notice is that grasp of the implications for the country of this technology is not where it should be. So this is not to criticize India, I think it is the United States. But in India, the government is all powerful. And so I do think that the ability to communicate with our top civil servants, actually even with the Prime Minister, is important. So with that, to go back to the question, I think 5G phones will get fairly cheap enough once the volume builds up. So I'm quite confident.
Thank you, Professor Paulraj. We're moving very quickly. The next question is for Kirti Gupta, and that's from Mr. Rajendran. Every rollover in the generation 2G to 3G to 4G and 5G entails enormous costs. Can the tech world ensure a less costly upgrade path?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, Kirti.
Yeah, that's right. And that I think that relates to the previous question. And when you look at, there are actually nice charts that show every time there's a new generation, it's shift in technology, right? There is a spike in prices and then it drops really quickly. And you see that, for 2G, for 3G, for 4G, you see the prices go up because the very first products are at the frontier of the technology. They're the high-end products. And then as everybody starts implementing the technology, the prices decline. It's a pretty standard trend. I don't expect it to be different for 5G. Having said that, the difference for 5G is the following. Number one, in the smartphone spaces, the industry is more competitive than it has ever been. There are so many variety of smartphone or phone makers across the world, specifically in China, that I think you'll see devices in all cost brackets and in all feature categories. And second, for the other question, beyond devices, beyond wireless, handsets and etc., that will be a more challenging question, right? Because yes, volumes is what reduced prices. So you kind of need to see a little bit more deployment, jump starting of certain use cases, sensors and machines, etc., to then start seeing the prices fall. But I think it's going to happen just like it did for all other Gs.
Thank you, Kirti. The next question is for Mr. Vikram. That's from Freni Patel. And that's more on the geopolitics. With many countries banning or planning to ban Huawei, what impact would this have? And what is the take as far as India is concerned?
Hi, Udai. Thank you. Thank you, Freni, for this question. Firstly, the choice for India will be, let's say, directed by the government, because since it is, what would I say? It is something which all our members are licensees, and we are providing services on behalf of the government. So the final, implication will be the government would be the deciding agency as to where do you allow which kind of equipment to come into Indian networks. But the fact of the matter is, globally, if you see, the number of networks providers are kind of limited. And if you observed or noticed what Dr. Paulraj said, you see, who are the leaders in 5G? And there was this presentation on IPR as well, right? Who are the major stakeholders who hold the assets, so to say, in terms of 5G provisioning? So the country has to take a call, and it is something which I'm sure all of us on this webinar will be looking at keenly. and the implication, of course, would be at what time and stage do you take take a direction on this. That is what the environment is currently. But of course, everybody is looking at it very closely. Needless to say, that when it is like looking at the golf ball. You need to focus very well, and the way the golf ball travels is what follow through you do on that to get a good stroke, right? So that's how it will be.
Thank you, Vikram. And the last question, I'm really sorry to some of the panel participants who have, we have got several questions, but we don't have so much of time. But the last question is to Mr. Deepak Maheshwari from my colleague Amol Kulkarni. While there are several obvious benefits, what are some of the obvious risks to consumers from 5G that may result in tangible financial losses and exclusion? And how can we use 5G to overcome these challenges?
So first of all, I think in terms of 5G, we did talk about creating awareness. For example, Professor Paulraj mentioned about the civil servants and policy makers and decision makers. I think one of the other things that we need to do is we need to have a better digital literacy among the users themselves. So for example, when you have a speaker in your phone, even on a 4G network, which suddenly could start not just speaking, although the name is speaker, it also is in the listen mode. So the speaker starts listening and starts broadcasting to elsewhere at times without even your knowledge or awareness. And now, what are the pitfalls about privacy, cybersecurity, etc.? People need to be aware of that. So one major area I would say is in terms of the precautions that people need to take in terms of when they are using these new technologies. So it's like you got a new Ferrari at your hand, and you don't know how to apply the brakes, you don't know where the bumps are, and then suddenly you just go on a joyride. And I think that might be quite dangerous, not only for the users, but also others in their family, near, dear, but also third parties. For example, they could be a pedestrian and others also. So there are those challenges. Second aspect is that apart from some of the things that we need to do on the regulatory front in terms of spectrum and license fee, etc., I think increasingly what we also need to realize and internalize in the country that 5G is ultimately about convergence. So it's about convergence not only of networks, it's also about convergence at the device level, not only in terms of regulation, but also we need to have a convergence in terms of the policy making, which currently we do not have. So we have different ministries and departments doing different things, although we do have, thankfully, a common regulator across all these. And the other thing that I would just like to suggest is this. Many of these things are yet to be tested, but at the same time, to get a taste of those type of things, apart from the fact that the government last year did give permission to do trials of these 5G networks, which was permitted last year, I think what we also need to do is we can create a test bed of 5G for the time being through some common pooled resources. And there people could work with academia, with research, with startups, etc., in terms of trying out new type of use cases and also learn about how to do different type of things, so that as and when the networks are really ready and being rolled out at scale, we also have the necessary skills and speed on how to use these things.
Thank you, Deepak ji. I think with that we come to the end of the webinar. I think we've already overshot the time, and I once again thank all the speakers who have been patient enough to stay on with us. And with that, I request my colleague Siddharth to quickly summarize the webinar and just deliver the vote of thanks in a minute. Siddharth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Udai. We have had a very insightful discussion in this webinar. This will certainly be very useful for CUTS in finalizing its consumer-facing report, 5G in India, demystifying reality from myth. Summing up, in particular, we may focus upon the following key takeaways. 5G is not just another G. Its enhanced capabilities will unlock many useful consumer-centric and industrial use cases by enabling machine-to-machine and person-to-machine communication. India would need to upgrade its presently inadequate network infrastructure with respect to fiberization, download, upload capabilities, spectrum allocation, etc., in order to realize the full potential of 5G, early, efficiently, pervasively, and inclusively. This also becomes crucial in light of the prevailing digital divide in the country, especially in light of the COVID pandemic, in order to spur the uptake and usage of digital technology-driven services, which would have many social implications as well. Make in India needs to be implemented in spirit. That is, there is a need to move from mere assembly to actual innovation and manufacturing chipsets, which would require investments and intent on R&D. Fourth, the government must also regain its lost momentum on 5G, which started with the Digital India program and drafting the NDCP. India's strength in software development must be leveraged in developing data-driven use cases for 5G. With respect to spectrum allocation, the current levels of availability are inadequate. Also, the government probably needs to lower the price of spectrum since they are much higher than the global averages considering the purchasing power of telecoms in India. The necessity of having a minimum reserve price also needs to be relooked. Summing up, market won't wait for India and 5G is needed now. We made the mistake of delayed transition from 3G to 4G and the same must not be made with 5G. CUTS survey findings also showed that consumers are eager to avail 5G services. Once finalized, we shall be circulating the final version of our report with all the speakers and participants. We thank the panelists for their valuable insights and participants for attending the webinar. With this, we close today's session. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you once again on behalf of CUTS.